What is this? Take a guess. What part of the body does this look like to you? What about these anatomical drawings? What part of the body is on display? As we have learned in the medical knowledge of the body unit, the classical writers Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Galen had a long influence on medical thinking, even into the 1700s. Reproductive biology and anatomy was no exception. From the 1600s to the 1800s, animal dissection and human autopsies continued debates about the contributions of male and female bodies to reproduction. It is important to remember that doctors and medical practitioners were trained in theory with little practical experience. Increasingly, with the scientific revolution of the 1600s and 1700s, doctors used observation and experiment and were more likely to believe what they could see with their eyes. However, the long-standing classical underpinnings of medical science meant that they had more than a few blind spots. There is a gender fluidity in the theory of the four humors. Women tend to be moist and cold, while males are hot and dry. The four humors theory explained menstruation. If men ejaculated seed, then menstruation was the female equivalent, a way of getting rid of excess moisture and trying to maintain a healthy balance. This is an important point to remember when we study the unit between genders. Aristotle believed that a man was the perfect version of the human body, while woman was an infertile man, quote unquote, or deficient. Aristotle thought only males actively contributed seed. Woman was a vessel, a passive receptacle, while the man had semen. A woman had menstrual blood, and this was considered to be semen that had not fully developed. So a woman only provided the form, the matter, while a man provided the seed, the way that a farmer plants his seed in the earth. So if you think of what is visible, a man's contribution to reproduction is a lot more obvious, while a woman's part is hidden, and this would remain a theme for a couple thousand years. With the theory of the four humors and Aristotle's ideas, even in the 1500s, it was believed that the seed deposited by the man could grow to become a male or female child, depending on the circumstances. And this leads to all kinds of handy advice to conceiving a boy, because it probably goes without saying that from the Renaissance to the 1800s, parents preferred a son as heir. So how to get a boy? Hold off on intercourse until some good strong seed develops. Wear head coverings or hats to keep essential fluids hot. Make sure the man is on top to keep the seed in place, and aim his seed at the hot side or right-hand side of the womb. The mental state of the pregnant mother could also affect the fetus in utero. Mothers were given trinkets like this cute little porcelain boy to contemplate in order to have a healthy son. Conversely, a fright or a terrible sight was believed to cause deformity or what was called a monstrous birth, such as this example that first appeared in the work of the French surgeon Ambroise Paré, who had a genuine medical interest in the causes of birth defects, whereas these figures also later reappeared more as marvels or freaks in cheap, popular versions of advice, who might ask the reader, what woeful maternal fancy produced such a monster? In the anatomical textbooks from Vesalius 1543 De Fabrica onwards, readers learned that male anatomical parts were the same in woman. While a man's penis and testes were outside the body, a woman's reproductive parts were inverted and enclosed inside the body. Was this to preserve female modesty or humility? To keep the female testes more moist and warm? Because a man's penis was better and more perfect than the hidden female version? As one translated text of the 1500s stated, On my honor, I would have preferred to leave out this chapter so that women would not become even more vain than they already are once they learn that they have testicles just like men. Moreover, these testicles not only support the nourishing of that baby in the womb, just as with any seed planted in the ground, but they are also fertile in themselves, just like the men's. And women do not lack a member, that is a penis, either. We'll come back to this point when we study sexualities, and also the confusion presented by an intersex body, such as a baby or an adolescent with indeterminate sex characteristics. In this era, people judged from what they could see, not what was hidden or invisible to the eye. So if the female testicles and inverted penis remained inside a woman's body because of her moisture, cooler nature, could excessive heat or excitement cause the genitals to, quote, come forth and hang as men's do, unquote, as one 17th century commentator phrased it. For Galen, unlike Aristotle, both male and female seed were required for conception, and this theory was taken up by medical practitioners that the female testes, or as we would say today, ovaries, contribute to conception. This meant that both a male orgasm and a female orgasm was needed to conceive. That perhaps might surprise you, that pleasure was important for conception. Without reliable contraception, it might have been harder for women to be sexually liberated, as in a post-1960s world. We tend to project a Victorian view of sex into the past, a kind of view that women should tolerate sex and, quote, lie back and think of England, unquote. That was not necessarily true before the 1800s. There was, however, a negative aspect to Galenic and early modern ideas of conception requiring male and female orgasm, and that was the implication that for rape, if a woman became pregnant after a rape, then she wasn't considered to have been forced because she must have climaxed to conceive. Of course, the ancients and the early moderns, such as Vesalius, were correct about human anatomy in some ways. As we know today, there is a homology between the male and female reproductive systems. It just did not involve the vagina or the uterus. Now, apparently, Realdo Colombo discovered the clitoris in the 1550s. Gabriel Falloppio tried to claim credit for the discovery too, the man the fallopian tubes are named after. Somehow I suspect that these men of science might not have been the first to, shall we say, discover it, but no woman got her name into the medical textbooks. The continued practice of dissection and autopsies allows the understanding of the male and female bodies to change, but the male body became the norm for illustrating such systems as veins, muscles, or skeletal structures. Yet, how do we see the female body? What is on display? The male body is the standard body, while the female body is always pregnant. As one historian explains, the male body is flayed of its skin in order to illustrate the venous system. The female body, by contrast, is fully covered with skin, and her torso is dissected in order to display the uterus. This is a bias that often continues in clinical trials even today, where the male animal or body remains the standard. In the 1660s, René de Graaf, a Dutch physician, completed dissections on rabbits, and, looking for eggs, he actually found the ruptured follicles in an ovary without the aid of a microscope. He thought he had seen eggs. He dismantled Galen's idea that male and female reproductive organs were the same, and instead called the female testicles, or balls, the ovaries, or woman's nest. One of the pioneers in using a microscope to explore animal and human bodies was a Dutch merchant in the cloth business. Anton van Leeuwenhoek used the microscope as a hobby. In 1677, Leeuwenhoek wrote to the secretary of the Royal Society in London, a group of scientists, a scientific academy. When he was working with a student, they had observed a multitude of small animals, or animalcules, in the semen of a man suffering from gonorrhea. They compared the sample to semen from a healthy one, and I quote, immediately after ejaculation. Just pause and think about that for a second. And he continued, I had seen such a multitude of live animalcules, more than 1,000,000, having the size of a grain of sand and moving in a space. Those animalcules had a round body, foam in the front, terminated in a point at the back. They were equipped with a tail with 5 to 6 times the body length. They progressed in a snake-like motion, helped by their tail. Leeuwenhoek suggested that if his observations were too scandalous, the Royal Society could decide not to publish it. In March 1678, he had repeated the observations in the semen of dogs and rabbits, and that these little creatures under the microscope stopped swimming and died gradually in the days after their collection. Leeuwenhoek later saw sperm in the fallopian tubes and female uterus, but it would be at least another 100 years before this was understood. Conception remained a mystery. Were little humans or embryos fully formed in sperm, pre-existing in eggs, as William Harvey suggested in 1651, ex ovo omnia, everything from the egg. In his autobiography later in life, Carl von Baer reflected on his discovery of the ovum in mammals. In the spring of 1827, I no longer doubted that the mammalian eggs came from the ovaries in a developed state, and that I wished to obtain a female dog who had been impregnated a few days previously. At the time, it was believed that the opening of the egg capsule, or Graafian vesicles, was directly owing to the act of copulation, which is not so. A dog was sacrificed. On dissecting her, I found several of the Graafian vesicles already burst, yet there were no others about to burst. When I observed the ovary, discouraged because my hopes were again disappointed, I discovered a small yellow spot in a little sac. Then I saw these same spots in several others, and indeed in most of them, always in just one little spot. How strange, I thought. What could it be? I opened one of these little sacs, lifting it carefully with a knife onto a watch glass filled with water, and put it under a microscope. I shrank back as if struck by lightning, for I clearly saw a minuscule and well-developed yellow sphere of yolk. Before I found courage to look at it a second time, I had to recover, since I was afraid of having been deluded by a phantom. It seems odd that a sight expected and so much longed for could frighten one when it actually occurs. There was, however, something unexpected in it. I had never thought that the content of the mammalian ovum could look so similar to the yolk of a bird's egg, with only a simple microscope with triple lens. Childbirth was a woman-centered activity, the positive side of community and everyone knowing everyone else's business. Neighbors were important. Female neighbors, relatives, mothers who had experienced birth came to help with delivery, and also for the 4 to 5 week lying-in period after the birth, as the new mother recovered and established her nursing of the baby. In this German midwifery manual from 1513, we see a birthing stool and the midwife guiding the pregnant woman and relying on a female neighbor or relative for support. Notice that it is published in a vernacular language, in German, more likely to be read by women than Latin. Midwives began to be licensed in England in 1512, under the Act for the Regulation of Surgeons and Physicians. A midwife had to have 6 women testify that she was of good character and would ensure that a stillborn child could be baptized. Midwives had to take an oath to swear to serve rich and poor, not hide the parentage of a child, not use sorcery or witchcraft, and not to procure abortions. In a scene from 17th century France, a crowd of female relatives, neighbors, servants, and friends support the mother as the midwife gently guides the baby's emerging head. The fire is ready to warm water to wash the newborn baby. And this is the happy and relieved father, not a doctor. The newborn here is being breastfed by a young wet nurse in the foreground, and a servant is already stretching her arms out to take the baby and give the newborn a bath in the green bowl. The mother is recovering under the blankets. Breastfeeding is a prophylactic. It lowers a woman's fertility, so the choice to nurse one's own child or to hire a wet nurse affected the rhythms and spacing of birth, with many effects, of course, on the woman's body. The upper class, or those of a higher social status, usually hired a wet nurse. That meant that they had babies more frequently and could provide the much-wanted heir, hopefully male. Lower down the social scale, mothers nursed their own babies or served as wet nurses, and they had fewer pregnancies. Female midwives acted as healers before the birth, doing prenatal care, active during the birth with the help of female relatives and neighbors, and then following up with help and visits, for example with nursing, during the lying-in period. With problem deliveries such as obstruction, stillbirth, cesarean section, calling the university-trained male physician was usually a signal that the mother would die. Remember that 15th and 16th century physicians seldom saw or examined female genitalia in any professional capacity. Public anatomic dissection of corpses occurred only in the winter. Remember, there were no morgues with refrigeration. The physician Mercurio had witnessed a female corpse dissection at the University of Bologna when he was a student in 1568, and the next time he had the experience was 10 years later in 1578 as an assistant to remove a live fetus from a woman who had been killed. This 1506 woodcut supposedly depicts the first caesarean section used to extract Julius Caesar from his mother around 100 BC. An apocryphal story, by the way. But the woodcut is useful to provide context to the story of the death of Isabella del Volpe from pregnancy and childbirth in the 1540s. Look at how the women, including the midwife, are portrayed apart from the men, with only the barber surgeon, wielding a very scary-looking knife, actually touching the mother's body, while the midwife cares for the child. Why did a notary record witness testimony about what happened to the mother, as well as the roles of each person who was involved in her care? In this case, because it was the mother's first child, if the child looked fully developed and human, and lived even if only for a few seconds, then the cash and money the bride brought to the marriage became her husband's inheritance. If not, the wealth went back to her natal family. Money was at stake. Think of how the women attending the childbirth act. What was the role of the midwife? The surgeon employed by her family? How does he check to see if Isabella is alive and try to keep the baby alive? Why is a barber called in to actually touch the corpse and do the cesarean? Why do they call a priest? And what does he do for the baby? Gender, social status, religion, and inheritance are all in play in the care of Isabella del Volpe and her baby. In the 18th century, male doctors became more involved in the birth process, bringing in the use of instruments such as forceps, invented by the Chamberlain family in the 1600s, but kept a family trade secret until the 1730s. Look at their methods of care. Think of the attitudes of midwives such as Katharina Schrader to the doctors she encountered while caring for mothers. As more men entered the obstetric profession, death rates among mothers increased. It was much safer to be delivered by a midwife at home than by a doctor in a hospital. Consider that the 17th to 18th century Dutch midwife, Katharina Schrader, had a maternal mortality rate of 4.6 in 1,000, while the 18th century American midwife, Martha Ballard, lost only one mother in 1,000 deliveries. A study of midwives paid by a charity to deliver poor women at home in London, found that of almost 1,900 deliveries between 1774 and 1780, there was a maternal mortality rate of 3.7 per 1,000. Maternal deaths from London hospital deliveries in that same time period ranged from 16.6%, that is 166 per 1,000 deaths, to 60%, or 608 deaths per 1,000. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever, a kind of infection that sets in days after giving birth, was common in 18th and 19th century hospitals and often fatal. When Dr. Semmelweis was hired at the Vienna General Hospital, he noticed that the mothers on the wards with midwives had a better survival rate than women giving birth treated by male doctors. Why were the midwife clinics safer for childbed mothers? The blue line shows midwives on a separate floor with a separate clinic. The pink line shows male doctors who were frequently conducting autopsies before doing their hospital rounds. At the time, no one understood about germs or microbes, and again, medical practitioners understood what they could see, so that while they could see the pus on a wound and the fever to fight infection, they did not understand the cause. A cut that led to the death of a doctor friend made Semmelweis realize that he and other physicians were the sources of contamination, as they did autopsies and then visited their patients without washing their hands. I devoted nearly every morning before the professor's rounds in the obstetrical clinic to these autopsies on female corpses. I conducted my gynecological studies in the morgue. I then went into the labor room and began to examine all my patients, as my predecessors and I were obliged to do, so that I could report during the professor's morning rounds. My hands, contaminated by cadaverous particles, were thereby brought into contact with the genitals of so many women in labor in that April 1847. From 312 deliveries, there were 57 deaths. Only God knows the number of patients who went prematurely to their graves because of me. I have examined corpses to an extent equaled by few other obstetricians. He announced a strict regime of hand washing for the doctor's maternity clinic that can be seen in the red rectangle. Despite the success of reducing deaths by imposing hand washing in chloride of lime with instant reduction in mortality rates, Semmelweis lost his job a couple years later and went home in disgrace to Hungary. The idea that gentlemanly doctors might be unclean and should wash their hands was not accepted by many in the medical profession. As we have seen, it is hard to let go of long-established ideas.